Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wanted to know about music. So, whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place, so stick with us. Now, this week, I want to talk about the thing that pretty much everyone is talking about these days, but of course through a different lens. I want to talk about the Super Bowl, but specifically the Bad Bunny moment, of course. So let's face it, there are so many moments in music that feel bigger than a performance. Moments that don't just entertain, but reveal something about where culture is heading. And this year, that moment was definitely when Bad Bunny stepped onto the Super Bowl halftime stage. Not as a guest, but as the headliner, performing entirely in Spanish on one of the most watched stages in the entire world. Absolutely incredible. So, for decades, the Super Bowl halftime show has symbolized American pop dominance. It's where global superstardom is cemented, and actually where English language hits typically define this whole spectacle. And yet this time, millions of viewers, not just across the US, but across the entire world, tuned in to watch a performance where many of them didn't even understand the lyrics. And still, they watched, they streamed, they searched for the songs afterwards. Actually, it was the most watched Super Bowl halftime show of all time, which is just so iconic and really just highlights the key parts of what I want to talk about today. Now, streaming numbers, they surged globally in the hours following the show. Bad Bunny's songs climbed the charts, social media filled with clips, reactions, memes, and yeah, like I said, it became one of the most watched halftime performances in history, and that's what completely fascinates me here. If so many viewers didn't understand the words, why did it resonate so deeply? What were they responding to? Is it the rhythm, the spectacle, the charisma of the performance? Is it the cultural pride embedded in the set? Or is it something more fundamental? Something about how we experience music that goes beyond language entirely? Now, we often assume that lyrics are the heart of a song for a lot of us, that the meaning lives primarily in words, and to understand music, we have this notion that we need to decode the message. But what happens when comprehension is removed, when you can't translate in real time? Are you excluded from the experience, or are you engaging with it in a more kind of instinctive and embodied way? Now, I think that it really forces us to confront this bigger question, which is, why does music sung in a foreign language still resonate across borders? Why do so many of us fall in love with songs in Spanish, Korean, Portuguese, Arabic, you name it, even if we can't translate a single line? Does understanding the lyrics actually matter as much as we think it does? Or have we been overestimating the role of literal comprehension and underestimating the power of emotion, sound, and identity? Because when millions of people cheer, dance, and replay songs that they don't linguistically understand, obviously something important is happening here. We're responding to something. And this moment, like I said, it wasn't just a performance. It was this cultural shift actually unfolding live on stage. A reminder that global pop music may no longer revolve around one dominant language, and perhaps the future of music is multilingual by default. So in this episode, I want to explore what that moment reveals about music, about language, about psychology, and about what it really means to understand a song. And as someone who loves listening to songs that I don't understand, I think this is an absolutely fascinating topic. So let's get into it. So let's move from the cultural moment to the psychological one. What actually happens in the brain when we don't understand the words of a song? Because the assumption most of us make here is simple, right? If I don't understand the lyrics, I can't fully understand the song. And we tend to believe that meaning lives in language, that comprehension equals connection. But research suggests something far more interesting here. So, studies consistently show that emotion perception in music is often independent of the comprehension of the lyrics. So, in other words, people can accurately identify whether a piece of music sounds happy, sad, tense, nostalgic, or calm, even when they don't understand the language that it's being sung in. Now, this has been demonstrated across cultures and languages. Listeners rely heavily on musical cues rather than the somatic content to interpret feeling. So, what are those cues? First off, we've got melody. So, the contour of a melody, whether it rises, falls, leaps dramatically, or moves kind of stepwise, carries emotional information. Slower, descending melodic lines are often associated with sadness or introspection, while faster, upward moving phrases tend to signal excitement or joy. Then we have rhythm. So, tempo alone has a powerful effect on emotional perception. Faster tempos increase physiological arousal, so raising your heart rate and activating the body, which in turn we interpret as excitement or energy. And then you've got slower tempos, which are more likely to be experienced as calm, reflective, or melancholic. Groove, syncopation, and rhythmic density also shape how embodied a song feels, influencing whether we experience it as grounding, urgent, or kind of celebratory. And then you've got timbre, which is the colour or texture of sound. So a raspy vocal can communicate grit or vulnerability. A breathy vocal can signal intimacy. And bright instrumentation often feels energetic or playful, while darker, heavier tones can evoke this sense of seriousness or tension. And then you've got prosody, which is the musicality of speech itself. Even if you don't understand Spanish, Korean, or Arabic, you can still hear whether a voice sounds tender, aggressive, or whatever it might be. And prosody carries this emotional information in everyday speech, and singing actually amplifies that. The human brain is highly sensitive to these vocal cues because they evolved as part of our communication system long before written language even existed. So, from an evolutionary perspective, tone often mattered more than words did. And neuroscientific research supports this distinction. Emotional responses to music activate brain regions such as the amygdala and the ventral striatum, which are involved in emotion and reward processing, which happens even when the listener can't somatically process the lyrics. And by contrast, understanding words actually engages classical language areas like the Broca's and Wernicke's areas in the brain. And these systems can operate somewhat independently. So you can feel deeply moved by a song, even if the language processing centers are not fully engaged. And this suggests that emotional understanding and linguistic understanding are not the same process, which raises this fascinating question. Do we actually need lyrics to understand a song? Or have we been equating understanding with translation when they're actually fundamentally different? So when someone watches a Bad Bunny performance and, for example, feels goosebumps, dances instinctively, or just feels the joy radiating through the whole stadium, that is a form of understanding. It may not be semantic understanding, but it is emotional comprehension. And cross-cultural research actually further supports this as well. So studies have shown that listeners from different cultural backgrounds can really identify basic emotions in unfamiliar music traditions. And while culture absolutely shapes nuance and interpretation, there are these shared acoustic patterns, such as tempo, intensity, and even pitch range, that humans respond to across different cultures and societies. Some researchers even argue that music may tap into neural systems that predate complex language. So, long before humans developed sophisticated verbal communication, we used rhythm, vocal tone, and coordinated sound to signal safety, danger, bonding, and group cohesion as well. So, when we respond emotionally to music without understanding the words, we are engaging those older systems. And that's something that I've spoken a lot about here on The Sound Mind. And in that sense, music operates through this kind of parallel channel to language. It doesn't replace language, but it doesn't depend on it either. There's also evidence that when lyrics are in an unfamiliar language, listeners do just shift their attention towards those acoustic features. So instead of focusing on narrative meaning, we become more attuned to those different features like texture, harmony, rhythm, performance dynamics, you name it. And in some ways, not understanding the words can actually heighten our sensitivity to the music itself. The experience changes rather than diminishes. So instead of analyzing the meaning, we just feel it for what it is. We're decoding the sound instead of decoding sentences in that moment. So when millions of people stream and celebrate songs that they can't translate, the question is no longer whether they understand them. Maybe a better question is, what kind of understanding are we talking about? Is understanding a song about knowing what the singer is saying, or about recognizing what they're expressing? Because those are not the same thing. And perhaps the real power of foreign language music is that it forces us to confront that difference. Now, let's take this one step further. Not only can we feel the emotion of music that we don't understand, but it turns out music can actually teach us the language that we don't yet speak. So, in other words, music here is a bridge into learning. Now, research in linguistics and educational psychology has shown that listening to music in a foreign language can lower communication anxiety. So, in one study with university students learning a second language, those who regularly listened to songs in that language reported feeling significantly more confident and less stressed about speaking. So, music creates this low pressure environment, a space where mistakes don't matter and where learners can experiment with sounds, words, and pronunciation without fear of judgment. It's emotionally engaging, but also pedagogically powerful. And singing along can actually boost learning even more. Studies show that when learners sing lyrics, they retain vocabulary and grammar patterns more effectively than when they simply read or listen. So pronunciation improves because singing forces articulation, rhythm, and intonation in ways that actually mimic natural speech patterns. Music embeds language in memory through melody and rhythm, turning these kind of abstract words into something tangible and memorable. So music here is leveraging our brain's emotional and auditory processing to make language stick. And real-world evidence really supports this as well. So after Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance, Duolingo actually reported a notable spike in Spanish lessons, suggesting that his set didn't just entertain viewers, it motivated them to actively learn the language. Millions of people across the globe were suddenly inspired to engage with Spanish, not through classrooms or textbooks, but through rhythm, melody, and the joy of singing along. And kind of acts as this gateway, like a motivational catalyst, rather than a barrier to comprehension. I think that's so amazing. So, if music can inspire people to pick up words, phrases, and even grammar without formal instruction, then perhaps the foreign language songs we love are less about exclusion and more about invitation. Music makes language approachable. It creates context, conveys emotion, and provides repeated exposure in a way that traditional learning rarely can. In effect, the brain is doing the work without even realizing it. It's tuning into phonetic patterns, intonation, and meaning embedded in melody. So the question becomes, is music a barrier to understanding or a bridge into it? When we fall in love with a song in a language that we don't speak, we aren't failing to understand. We're being invited to engage, to learn, and to feel. And for many listeners, that's honestly more motivating than a classroom ever could be. I know it was always like that for me in school. I remember trying very hard to learn French, but when my French teacher brought in music, that just really opened up new barriers of entry for me. And I love French music. It's amazing. But I definitely do not speak French. But I do also love reading translations of lyrics as well, which of course you are able to pick up on certain phrases and things like that. So I do feel very proud of myself when I can understand the odd bit because, yeah, that definitely comes from music and not from like 10 years of doing French in school. Okay, so now that we've explored how music communicates emotion and even teaches language, let's step back and look at the broader cultural picture. Because language in music is never just about words, it's all about identity, power, and representation. And Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance really makes this clear. By performing entirely in Spanish and unapologetically foregrounding his Puerto Rican heritage, he challenged the long-standing assumption that global pop music must be in English to succeed. And that's so incredible. So, language in music, it isn't just a tool for communication, it's a real marker of identity. Singing in Spanish on one of the world's largest stages was this statement. This is who I am. This is where I come from, and my culture belongs here, especially in this broader political picture that we're seeing at the moment. It really is so powerful. And in a sense, every lyric was an assertion of presence, visibility, and pride. And for many viewers who shared that language or heritage, seeing a global superstar perform in Spanish wasn't just entertainment, it was so empowering. When people see themselves reflected in popular media, it can enhance self-esteem, cultural pride, and feelings of belonging. But conversely, the absence of representation can reinforce marginalization or invisibility. And that's why Bad Bunny's performance is so significant. It wasn't just a set list, it was a declaration that Spanish language music and Latin culture more broadly belongs in mainstream global pop culture, and definitely it does. But of course, the reactions were mixed. Some viewers felt excluded, disconnected, or frustrated that they couldn't understand the lyrics. Others felt seen, acknowledged, and celebrated. And both of these reactions highlight this fundamental truth that language carries symbolic weight. It does signal inclusion or exclusion, authority or marginality, familiarity or just other. And political and cultural commentators took note. Some critiqued the performance, framing it as a foreign intrusion into an American institution, while others praised its authenticity and cultural significance. And honestly, these reflect these deep-seated social and cultural dynamics about who gets to be represented and whose language is deemed as mainstream. Now, this tension between connection and division, visibility and invisibility, is really at the heart of music's cultural power. Language in music can unite people or alienate. It can inspire or provoke, depending on the context. Now, in the case of Bad Bunny performing in Spanish on this global stage, it sparked this collective reflection. Whose voices are amplified in pop culture? Whose stories are told? And who gets to define what counts as mainstream? So, as we watch audiences around the world dance, sing along, or feel moved by music in a language that they don't fully understand, we see that emotion alone isn't the whole story. Music communicates on multiple levels simultaneously. We've got the emotional, the cognitive, and the cultural. Understanding the words is one thing, but understanding the identity, the heritage, and the cultural assertion behind them is another. And in that sense, a song can really carry more meaning than literal comprehension ever could. Now, let's zoom back in and look closely at what I like to call the Bad Bunny effect. So, let's take a look at his performance, where culture, identity, and emotion collided in real time, and the impact of foreign language music became impossible to ignore for everyone. The Super Bowl setlist was unapologetically Spanish, blending reggaeton, salsa, and Latin trap music. Every song reflected his Puerto Rican roots and musical traditions that had long existed outside of the mainstream English language pop canon. And yet, like I said, despite most viewers not understanding the words, the performance dominated global charts almost immediately. Streaming numbers didn't just rise in Spanish-speaking countries, they surged worldwide. People were replaying songs, creating social media content, and discussing the lyrics of songs that they couldn't fully translate on the spot, but really just kind of had this interest in going to look at his music further. Now, if you haven't seen the performance yet, which if you haven't, have you been living under a rock? But please go and check it out and tell me you didn't find yourself clapping your hands or shaking your hips. I feel like it's impossible to sit still with those beats. And I know that the majority really felt that way. The energy is contagious. Wow, I was in awe. Also, the camera work, absolutely incredible. I love that he got the global stage, but what I don't want to do is act like this is a new thing, because Bad Bunny is literally in the top 3 streamed artists of all time, way before the Super Bowl performance. So this is definitely not a new thing. But what the Super Bowl moment did do was reach these all new heights and reach audiences that perhaps didn't respond to his music in such a way before, but this really demonstrated its power. He also had a little orchestra moment in there, violinist, which was absolutely amazing. Lady Gaga came out and sang Bruno Mars's verse, who Bruno Mars, by the way, is also from Puerto Rican descent, so that definitely was no accident. She was wearing the flag colours too, which was just absolutely stunning. Ricky Martin was there as well, also from Puerto Rican descent. There was a wedding, which apparently was a real wedding. So just so many iconic things happening. Now, the peak of the performance was Bad Bunny addressed the crowd in Spanish, stating his full name, not his stage name. And the translation of what he said was, "I'm here today at Super Bowl 60, and it's because I never ever stopped believing in myself. You should also believe in yourself. You're worth more than you think. Trust me." And that's such a beautiful and powerful message. And of course, so many people went and looked up what he was saying after the performance just to really feel like they fully understood that moment. Because even if you couldn't understand in the moment that he said those words, it was felt in the way that they were expressed, that this was an important message being told here. But his first and only English words of the entire show actually were "God bless America." And then he proceeded to name every Latin American country in Spanish. And then he continued through Central and South America before ending with the USA, Canada, and then finally his country, Puerto Rico, again. So he was really just trying to redefine what America means. And in this kind of context right now, as a melting pot of cultures and people. There was also this powerful message in the background which spoke to the political landscape of not just America right now, but honestly, the whole world. And it read, "The only thing more powerful than hate is love." And on the football was the message, "Together we are America." Now, I found myself getting emotional at the end. I'm not American, I'm not Puerto Rican, but wow, it just felt so powerful and euphoric, and really just showing that music can unite people and help stand for such a powerful message that wants to break down borders, because people have their different views, whatever, but music is loved by all of us, and I personally think regardless of language. Now, what we're seeing with Bad Bunny, it isn't an isolated phenomenon. It's part of a much larger trend here, the internationalization of music. Over the past decade, the idea that global pop has to be sung in English to travel the world has steadily fallen apart, I would say. And now, music from languages and places once considered niche in the mainstream is not just being streamed, but it's being embraced, shared, and celebrated worldwide. So, take K-pop, for example. Groups like BTS and Blackpink have topped charts and sold out stadiums across the globe. And most of their biggest hits are sung almost entirely in Korean. Their fandoms don't just consume the music, they learn the choreography, study the lyrics with translations, and really adopt the cultural practices that are connected to the songs. And this success of K-pop showed the world that language isn't a barrier to fandom. Engagement is. And then you've got Afrobeat and Amapiano, which have sounds rooted in West and Southern Africa, and they've found huge international audiences as well. Artists like Burna Boy, Wizkid, they've collaborated with global stars, bringing their rhythms into arenas and playlists that span all of these different continents. And these genres in particular, they thrive on groove and energy, proving again that rhythm can be a universal language. We've also seen French rap and French music in general continue to influence global music culture, not just within Francophone countries, but among fans worldwide. There's also been a resurgence of interest in Japanese city pop, which is a genre from the 70s and 80s that blew up literally decades later thanks to online communities and this algorithm-driven discovery that we're living in. Vintage tracks are finding new life with listeners who don't speak a word of Japanese, but they feel something deep in the sound. And then, of course, we've got Spanish reggaeton. From Daddy Yankee to Bad Bunny, it's become a complete global staple. Songs in Spanish dominate playlists from Latin America to Europe to Southeast Asia. Not because listeners are forced into them, but because they connect, they stick, and they move bodies and hearts in ways that transcend language. So I think a huge part of what's driving this here is technology, specifically streaming platforms. Services like Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and TikTok, they've removed these geographic barriers that once kept music siloed by region. Where radio playlists used to be created by local markets, algorithmic recommendation systems now suggest songs based on listening behavior, not based on language or location. So a listener in Sweden might hear a song from South Africa recommended because someone with similar tastes clicked on it. And suddenly, the world soundscape expands without the listener ever even kind of having to ask for it. And it turns out that exposure to diverse musical genres can actually increase openness. So researchers found that when people are repeatedly exposed to sounds outside of their usual preferences, they become more receptive, not only to the music itself, but to the cultures and contexts that produced it. So, in other words, engagement breeds empathy and curiosity. And I think we really see that with the Super Bowl, that when algorithms expose us to unfamiliar sounds, the effect isn't just novelty, it can also be this extended level of openness and open-mindedness in general. But that raises an interesting question, I think. Are we becoming more culturally open or just algorithmically curious? Are we genuinely embracing these sounds on a deeper level, or are we simply following the path of least resistance that technology kind of lays out for us? Think about your own listening habits for a moment. What's an artist that you love but you don't understand language-wise? Maybe you adore a Korean group's latest track or an Afrobeat anthem that gets you moving. Why do you connect with it? Is it the groove, the production, the emotional layers that the vocals carry, even without kind of understanding it? I'm really curious what kind of artists you all are loving and why. I also love how so many artists do collaborations with artists from other countries, and we see songs both in English and Spanish, in English and French. I think of Saint Laurent, for example. He does songs in English, French, and Arabic. The Weeknd's done collaborations with Rosalia and other Spanish artists, and it really just bridges borders through music. And it's something that I absolutely love to see. We live in this music world, at least, which is less centered on borders and more centered on experience, and where the music that moves us isn't defined by what we understand linguistically, but by what we feel, share, and just find ourselves returning to again and again. So as we listen across languages, cultures, and rhythms, we're forced to ask ourselves, what does it mean to love a song that you can't translate? And what does that love say about the kind of world that we're building as well? So, what do you think is music's true language? By now, we've seen that it's not as simple as lyrics or translation. Emotion transcends words. We can feel joy, heartbreak, excitement, or longing, even when the lyrics are entirely foreign to us. But yet, language still matters profoundly. It carries identity, pride, and culture. Singing in different languages is never neutral. It signals belonging, heritage, and authenticity. When Bad Bunny took the stage this year, it wasn't just about making people dance. It was all about asserting Puerto Rican identity, showing the world that Spanish language music belongs at the center of global pop. And I think there wasn't a better time to make that assertion. It was absolutely timely and necessary. And I think that we can't reduce this all to the cliche that music is universal, because I think, while of course it is, that phrase risks flattening the rich complexity of the power of music. Music may be universally felt, but it's always culturally grounded. It carries history, politics, pride, and perspective, whether or not we speak the language. I think that it can never be neutral, but it doesn't mean that other people can't appreciate it and love it in the same way. And I think that all links back to this increased openness and wanting to learn about a new culture through the amazing, beautiful music that they have. And that brings us to an exciting future, an exciting idea for the future of pop, I guess, and music in general, that maybe the goal isn't one dominant language at the top of the charts. At least I hope it's not. Maybe it's many languages, many voices, many cultures intersecting and resonating across borders. And I love that we're seeing that already. And I think we're really heading in a great direction in terms of this kind of melting pot of musical cultures. Language isn't a wall. It's a gateway into the stories, identities, and experiences that we might never have accessed otherwise. And music is this kind of key that opens that up for all of us. So, in the end, music reminds us that connection doesn't always require comprehension. It reminds us that we can celebrate difference and shared feeling at the same time. And also reminds us that perhaps the true language of music is emotion, but also that the richness of that emotion comes from the culture, the identity, and the humanity behind that music as well. But that is it for today's episode. I couldn't not talk about this. I wanted to do an episode on the topic for a while, but now just felt like the absolute perfect moment. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music just as much as you do, or may just find it interesting. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Also, come and say hi over on Instagram and on Threads at the Soundmind Talks. I want to hear all about what you thought of Bad Bunny's performance, who some of your favourite foreign language artists are, and yeah, what's top of your list at the moment. Absolutely love to hear all of your stories. So please reach out and start a conversation over there. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on the Sound Mind.